Everybody. So my name is Nell Tenhaff. I'm an artist, currently living near Peterborough, out in the country, but lived for quite a long time in Montreal earlier in my life, kind of became an artist there, and then lived in Toronto for 20 years, from 1997, where I taught at York, still teach at York. I forget that I'm not quite out of York. So I work in electronic media and on and off with interactive forums for many decades. So my first foray into interactive was way back with that Teledon system. Some of you might recall that in the early 80s. So on and off with that. So our panel is focused on, well, it's not any one thing, I don't think, but definitely we're going to be looking at embodiment, a term which came up in a really interesting way in the first panel, the land as embodied. I think our embodiment does zero in more directly on kind of distributed systems that include humans, machines or technologies or computational systems. And that, so I guess a working definition for us, well, one thing is that coming out of yesterday, we liked the idea of embodiment, engaging people in a disorganizing and reorganizing of perception. Noted that one because I liked it a lot. And I would also say disturbing, I think that term came up, disturbing perception. And so by embodiment, we mean being inside a whole cognitive sensory system that is connected with its surround, like our bodies are, in which we encounter distributed agencies. And these agencies are human, non-human, and technological, and of course, non-human meaning organic, inorganic. So really, we're trying to think of it as a whole distributed system. So yes, the land can come back in with that sense of distributed. And another idea that came up yesterday, right at the end of the day, actually, when we were talking, was this very established terminology called the human in the loop. That comes out of simulation language and methods that go way back, probably back to cybernetics from the 1950s, classic cybernetics, and have to do with developing, simulation systems in which the human is in a loop or in an interaction with a technology, and that it's kind of interesting to think back to that because we might want to be thinking about the human in that loop as a little bit less kind of centered or being, the central figure. So again, that idea of dispersing. So yeah, I've actually got a lot more to say, but I think I'll hang on to it until after the presentations because we'll be having a discussion that will take these things up. So our first presenter is Davide Rokeby. David is an artist who's been making works of electronic video and installation art since 1982, also early 80s. His practice has addressed issues of, among other things, digital surveillance and what I call process time. I mean, I know you're interested in time, but I don't think you've ever necessarily used that term for it. He has exhibited internationally, very well known, and he's done several major art commissions. So David lives in Toronto, and he teaches as a lecturer at the Ryerson University RTA School of Media.
Thanks, Nell. Thanks to the organizers for bringing us all together. It was a fantastic discussion yesterday, very energizing and exciting, and it's great to have these opportunities out of the distractions of our lives to actually spend some time thinking about these things or sharing our ideas about these things. The brief talk I'm going to give really comes from a moment in time for me around 1989. And so I'll be talking about ideas that came out of the research I did in the 80s with body interaction with bodies and machines, and which led me into the work I was doing in the 90s, which took off from that to start questioning what the implications of that were for questions of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence at the time was much less capable than the deep learning, et cetera, that we're seeing now, but it was something that really fascinated me, the question of what it means to think about producing a mind. What do we understand a mind is, and what does it mean to actually sit down and try to program one? So I'm going back to 1989, talking about the things, that moment, and I think it applies still to questions about the body in relationship to these sorts of systems now. So I'm going to see if I can read my slides. Okay. So the body is inconvenient in praise of generative frustration. Bodies are awkward, remarkable, difficult, ambiguous, fault-prone, and pleasureful. Technology can augment, replace, displace, and render our bodies invisible. Is valuing the human body simply nostalgia or romanticism? So it's an important, I think this is an open question. I will never forget seeing Stellark for the first time. For those of you who don't know Stellark, he has done a lot of things talking about going beyond the body or the disposability of the body, replacing the body. And I got so angry in the first lecture I heard of his that my body temperature went way up. And afterwards I went, wow, that's really interesting. He actually helped me to confirm my biases about the body. And I found that actually, in retrospect, his intervention by describing this challenge, by putting out this challenge that the body is obsolete, really helped to focus my mind. And that was a really valuable intervention. So it is an open question. Is it simply nostalgia and romanticism? I tend to think that it's not, but I understand that it might be perceived that way. Right, so very nervous system. This is a work I did through, I apologize to those who've seen this tape too many times. It was tape at some point, anyway. Very nervous system is a system that used cameras to track body movement, tried to gather information about the dynamics of movement rather than the locations of movement, and controlled, triggered, modulated virtual instrumentalists, shall we say, to compose music in real time to reflect the movement that it saw. And the music here is garbage, really, but it is, I think, it sets up a very compelling relationship between the body and the system. Its job is to be, to tie things together, to generate this coherent, intense, looping relationship. So the music is just, it has very utilitarian. Okay, so hopefully the video will come up. I don't know if I have to do something else to do. Okay, here we go. Will we have volume? Hope so. Okay. So in the system, there's a computer looking through a camera into an empty space, and every gesture that people make is essentially accompanied in real time by sounds that are intended to reflect something about the dynamics of that movement. And important to this is the fact that it is a feedback system, that you're starting to respond to sounds that you're hearing with new movement. So there is a kind of a, I'll let it speak for itself for a moment. So that gives you a sense of very nervous system. So one of the things I was asking with very nervous system, one of the questions I was asking was, what does it mean to try to engage with a logical system using the whole body? So I was spending time programming computers. I was sitting at the computer in bad posture with my body, complaining, feeling awkward, trying to forget that I had a body, sort of living in the space of logical programming. And then wanting to understand, so can I turn this upside down? Can I use the computer in a manner that allows me to reinforce my sense that I have a body, to reward me for having a body, and to allow me to explore that sense of having a body through the technology itself? So that's one of the many reasons that this piece came into being. And what can I learn about my relationship with my body through engaging in this way? So the first thing I learned was that there is, and I learned this, it's a known fact, but I learned it experientially, there's a time delay inherent in consciousness. I discovered that it seemed the system already knew I was going to move before I moved. This was very confusing. I set up a system especially to test this, where I would have it respond with a very noticeable, very loud sound as soon as it saw a hint of movement from my body, and I would stand there like a gunslinger, waiting to do the quick draw, trying to be as still as possible, and then suddenly move. And every single time, it made the sound at the moment I decided I was about to move. Very, very disturbing. And it was only by doing some research that I discovered the reason is that consciousness tends to be about 1/10 of a second behind our motor movements. So we make a movement, we make a decision to move, we commit to the movement, and we make the first initial movements before our consciousness is fully aware that we've made that decision. So the body is ahead of the mind in a sense, in this way, or the mind, in brackets there, or in quotation marks. So there's a time delay, and this creates a fascinating confusion. So it's no longer clear whether the sound precedes the movement or the movement precedes the sound, and the sense of what's in control of the other dissolves. So it creates a really interesting, very tight feedback loop. I was very inspired by Suzanne's use of the spiral in her work. We were talking about it last night. There's a sort of sense that the feedback loop spirals inside itself and gets tighter and tighter and tighter, so that there's the sense of what's controlling what is lost. So the next thing was distributed intelligence. Feeling my hand make a decision. So there are times when I felt that a sound was going to appear as a result of my hand. And the hand was feeling that. The hand felt like it was doing the conjuring. The decision was not coming here, but it was coming. And I started to feel as though my brain was more distributed through my body. That it was not located here, but in a diffuse sense, invading my whole body. Diffusion of the barrier between self and environment. One of the most interesting experiences I had that helped to illuminate this was spending, maybe an hour in my studio working with the very nervous system, and then walking outside onto the street. I lived on Spadina Avenue in Toronto, very, very busy, hectic street full of activity. And as I walked up the street after this experience, I felt as though every sound I heard was connected to my movement. I felt sort of an echo or a shadow or a reverberation of the interactive experience I'd been experiencing in my studio, transforming my relationship with things around me. And so that was a really interesting thing. And having felt that back in the studio, I started to realize that what was happening was, and this was actually something that was remarked upon to me by some choreographers who used my system, that although it really turns you in on yourself in the sense that you're interacting with yourself, the experience is not one of going in and closing in on yourself, but you feel that you're opening out into your environment. So it is something that starts to melt this sense that there is a membrane right here, and the self is in here, and everything else is out there. And so it becomes a sort of continuum of relative engagement or something. So the body expands out to fill the space, and the space around you absorbs into the body. And that was a really interesting experience. All unexpected experiences that for them to be generated by a computer. It was very exciting to be led on this strange journey through code, through this bunch of really very simple mathematical calculations, really, happening very quickly, and then going out into space and going back into the machine, going out into space again. Responsibility, the intermingling of action and observation. I was really, at the time I was working on Very Nervous System, I spent a lot of time trying to read Bergson's Matter and Memory. I'm not gifted at reading philosophy, although I love philosophy. I was reading my way through Matter and Memory, and one of the things he talks about a lot, and he seems to be really trying to get at, is this question of, so we take in the world around us, and we then output actions. And so what is in the middle there? What is there of self or something that is doing this translation? That, is it purely reflexive, or is there a more complicated mechanism that's inside there? So I was thinking about that. I was thinking eventually about the role, also in improvisation, of the integration, the tight integration of action and observation, that you are active, but not mindlessly active, that every action had to be accompanied by a simultaneous, constant, real-time awareness of the implications of those actions. And that was the state of mind that was necessary to engage most happily with the very nervous system, a kind of dual input-output, simultaneous input-output state. What I started to describe it to myself as being responsibility, the ability to respond, the ability to act and respond, and to accept my agency in the world while understanding that I didn't have total control over what was happening. The continuous presence of the human in the loop troubles and revitalizes, corrects the data in every cycle. So this was an interesting thing. The code itself was not terribly intelligent or terribly rich. It was enriched by the fact that it took me to places I hadn't expected, and my going to those new places added new things into the input to the code, and that came out again. So there was a kind of, and any errors, and this is kind of fascinating, any errors that happened, if the machine did not successfully translate my movements into an appropriate sound, I would collaborate to make it more convincing by extending that gesture a little longer until the sound happened. So there was a kind of many layers of complex engagement with the system, including perhaps an over-willingness to be credulous towards the interaction that was happening. Awareness distributed through the body is different than focused thought. Okay, well that's fairly obvious. I spent a lot of time during that time also doing experiments with diffuse perception. So I walked down the street for 2 weeks in Toronto, locking my fovea at as close to the vanishing point as I could find and deadening that, and paying attention only to things that were disappearing out of my field of view. So really paying attention to the periphery and experiencing the very different sense of space, relationship to the space that was that afforded. And that was very connected also to the state that was appropriate for being in a very nervous system, which was not to be willfully focusing on controlling something, but to be maximally engaged on as many different bandwidths and temporal wavelengths and things as possible at the same time. So, challenges. The tactile sense does not present a... Okay, so I'm just going to create a little space here. So the body is, as a sensing system, is very different from the eyes. The body as the sort of skin surface and the neurons, the tactile sensing neurons, very different from the eyes, which take in what's easily replicated as a very generic field of dots. It's almost mathematical Cartesian field of dots. Or the ears, which are very nice time series, they're receiving a very nice time series, which we can easily replicate. Tactile sense does not present a conveniently regular or normalized field of data. So while we can easily create lovely interactive sound and interactive video, and we can track and we can create nice vision systems and nice hearing systems, it's way harder to think about how to take seriously what the body is actually doing and digitize it and incorporate it into these interactions directly, as opposed to indirectly as it happens in a very nervous system. All the nerves in our body seem to be slightly differently purposed, so it's not it's a heterogeneous, a very heterogeneous field of things which are associated with very different functions and histories of functions and qualities of gesture, etc. And our sensors and actuators in the realm of touch are very poor, and our language around touch and embodiment are lacking. So we have lots of words for seeing and hearing. In the whole sphere of music, we have a vast vocabulary for describing these things. The same in imagery, but in touch, we have a very real limited set of words to describe it. And the sensors and actuators that we have available are also very limited. There have been some really exciting attempts to come to terms with this. The tactile bytes, or tactile bits, is it? Tangible bits? Tangible bits at MIT is a really interesting attempt to deal with touch in these ways. But it's almost impossible to capture the full complexity of our sensing system, of our tactile sensing system, using technology. I often reflect on the fact that some of my biggest solutions to challenging problems have come after a long period of thinking hard at the computer, when stepping into the shower, when my entire body is suddenly simultaneously being stimulated at every point, and as though that involves a shift in a way of thinking which unlocked a thought process that was getting stuck as I was sitting banging my head against the computer screen. And touch and bodily experience are useless to conventional notions of power except as a site of reward and punishment. So it's easy to use an image as a powerful thing for politics or power, and sound can be used very effectively, but touch, tactility, and embodiment are very hard to use. They don't play into those same structures. So there's not the same investment on every level, government investment, corporate, technological investment into trying to solve some of these problems. Maybe we don't want them to solve those problems, that's another question, but there's certainly nowhere near the kind of investment. The investment that went into generating the camcorder, an enormous amount of money went into making it possible for us eventually to have a camera here, but even just the handheld Sony Handycam, that was a huge amount of investment to make that happen. Yep, okay, I'm almost done here. So the body is in danger of falling out of culture. All the things that are becoming privileged that can be taken in effectively by machines and put out by machines are things that conveniently sidestep the body directly. And I think this is a big problem, or I'm asking, is this a big problem? Does this matter? We're so familiar with having a body that we take its presence for granted. So we're not really good at understanding how the body is important because it's always there. So we don't understand what it would be like to have it missing. An essential part of being human involves being situated in a moving, vulnerable, highly subjective, and inherently incomplete point of view. We are defined by our incompleteness, and I'm going to read this. We are defined by our incompleteness, the fact that we are a small fragment of an indiscernible and unfathomable whole. Our point of view in the world is indelibly marked by the character of our body, our interface with everything around us. The characteristics of our embodiment include our embeddedness in time. Our experiential envelope is narrowed to an almost inconceivably thin moment, and we use the faculties of memory and learning to expand this sliver into a sense of the world. The technologies we attempt to stretch beyond the limitations imposed by our incompleteness, but incompleteness will always be the nature of our existence, and I would argue it is also the motor of our existence, generating desire and the ephemeral sense of meaningfulness. Consciousness is perhaps our awareness of this incompleteness, and culture flowers out of it. So this awareness of incompleteness forces us to be masters at imagining beyond the limits of our immediate content or context. So it's almost in the sense that the whole notion of philosophy, etc., is generated by the fact that we are aware of that problematic or incompleteness. So consciousness arises out of the tension between what we are and what we can imagine. Consciousness flowers from the body. What would be without this generative frustration? So just to sum up, where this leads to in my thinking about contemporary artificial intelligence and machine learning is the problem that they rely on massive data sets to become effective. And so there have been remarkable advances in getting good data sets for images and good data sets for sounds. They will be very difficult to have really good data sets for the body. So the body is being left out. Again, maybe that's a good thing, but the body is being left out of the equation. And I do find myself wondering what is an intelligence, or what culture artificial intelligence generates if it does not come with a sense of the experience of the body, which seems to be something that helps to define at least what our human culture is based upon. And I think basically, yeah, so the final question is, and this is for the data science nerds out there, can this be modeled as an objective function? Can this issue be modeled as something that can be made the goal for a machine learning task? Or are we all models of machine learning, or are all our models of machine learning insufficient for this task? So just the nerdy end of the question. Thank you.
So we're not going to take questions between, but I'm open to anybody shouting out a vocabulary issue, because there's a lot of terms being used here that might be less known. Anybody? You don't want to have a definition of deep learning? You're okay. Sorry? Oh, sorry. I thought. Do you want to have a definition of deep learning, or shall we just proceed? Looks like we just proceed. Okay. I'm good. Okay, so our next presenter is Kristin Carlson. Kristin is an assistant professor in the Arts Technology program at Illinois State University. She explores the role that computation plays in embodied creative processes. So her background is in movement, technical theater, important, not theory, interaction design and programming. So, she's sort of working across choreography, media, performance, and she also publishes in the field of cognitive science, computing, electronic art. So I always find that interesting. So many of us are writers at the same time, trying to find answers to questions that parallel what we do in our practices. Okay, Kristin.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. So I think I can do, okay, great. So my background is really in movement and somatic practices and choreography. So, but I came to technology early on in my practice because I was really fascinated by the way that technology and thinking through procedural code made me reconsider my compositional processes. So I've done a lot of, this presentation will kind of flip a little bit of now I'm working in code so much that I'm thinking very much about what is my body experience in terms of what I am emitting and what can be captured by the technology, as well as what is my then receiving process and getting back out of generative works. And let's see here. So just for those who don't know, because I always have to define this, choreography really is a compositional process of the body. It really privileges sensory information and the relationship of the body within an environment and in relationship to other bodies. So sensation and tactility and awareness and expansion is really important in this process. And I think it's really fascinating because that knowledge is really what the decision-making process is in choreography. Dancers and choreographers are making choices based on what they feel, which is really fascinating when we start exploring the technology. Yes, and so I'll keep moving through because yes, this is a little small for me to see. But I have to jump into pop culture just for a second here because motion capture is such a big part of movies and video games. Yet we're still not able to really separate, like in video games, they still re-record motion capture data for every single character. They're not using machine learning yet to manipulate or reuse that data just because it's too expensive, whether computationally or financially. But then you'll see, like in Beauty and the Beast here, that the quality of the motion for those characters is really important. And so there's still, this actor has lots of padding and he's wearing, funny things on his feet to give him some additional qualities of movement in his real person that is then we're rigging another character onto in the post-production process. But I find this fascinating because there has been a lot of work that does try to separate the qualities of movement performance. So how you separate, one of the movement frameworks that's used often is called Laban movement analysis, and they talk about effort qualities where you can pull out elements of time and weight and flow and space. And in a way, you're kind of trying to separate what are the forces and the energies of the movement away from the actual space and time position of that body part. And there's been a lot of work in this. We're still not there yet. Movement data, who knew, is really complex and has a lot of parts to it. And when you're gathering things at 260 frames per second, that's a lot of information to crunch. But one of the places I like to go, I'm going to have to turn and read this real quick. But Merce Cunningham is a famous choreographer who's partners with John Cage. And he did a lot of work with technology and has this great quote that I look at some things and say, well, that's impossible for a dancer to do. But if I look long enough, I could think of a way it could be done. Not exactly as it's done on the screen, but it could prompt my eye to see something I've never thought of before. He was quite advanced in his career when, in the 90s, someone brought a computer to him that would do some animation of choreography. And he didn't really know how to use a computer at that point, and someone helped him construct these like weird dances on avatars that he then was so fascinated with how he could try and get his dancers to perform those works, because he, you know, again, as choreographers are working from the body and from their environment and any inspirations they can find. This was a totally new perspective, and while choreographers and artists have worked with technological concepts before and procedural ways of thinking, this was a very new thing. So I'm going to separate the last bit a little bit into talking about data recognition as how you're gathering input, which is how we're capturing data from the body. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of projects, but I've been really fascinated with some applied things recently. Like I've been working on a physical therapy project where patients always need more motivation to stay engaged in their rehabilitation process, because it's hard to just do those actions over and over again. But I was surprised when I started talking to physical therapists that they weren't interested in the qualities of the motion at all. They didn't care if you did them fast or slow. They didn't care if you had a lot of tension while you were doing them. As long as you extended and flexed your arms, it was fine. But just from my background in all of this, I think that there's something there to explore. So we've been doing a little bit of work to capture qualities of movement along with the body positions to create a game that patients could play. Although I'm still surprised at what works and what doesn't. So we right now have two games. One is that you're doing arm extensions and flicking. So you're doing short, quick, light movements in order to move through asteroids. But this works great. You'd think that the effort quality part of the qualitative part of this would be challenging. Whereas the next game, you're doing squats. So all you're doing is bending your knees. But I have not gotten this to work yet. After, I think we've collected data from maybe 50 different or more people doing squats and been applying machine learning in order to develop models of this. And so I'm always a little bit surprised at what things work and what things don't. But we have people playing with that. And then we have, so then there's the generation component, and this is the part I've kind of really fallen in love with, mainly because I'll say that this kind of work has come to really strongly out of my choreographic practice, because choreographers have, like most artists, you spend years developing techniques and skills that are based in a large history that you're trying to become very proficient at, as well as developing new ideas and worldviews about how you're going to shift and change those skills in new environments. But it's so easy to fall into your own patterns and develop habits that are really difficult to get out of. And it's one thing artists are always looking for new inspiration, and sometimes you find the right inspiration that'll work you out of those patterns, but sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. So I've done some work designing a system that would help me get out of those patterns. And I found that just providing new inspiration was not enough, that it was really easy to still fall back into patterns, but then, and I thought maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just a weird person, so I'll give it to some other choreographers. But I could give something that would create really weird shapes to a dancer, and they would do a ballet phrase out of this. And I have no idea, how, did you even look at the system? But it's just the way that, depending on whether the information is too foreign to them or the way they choose to interpret it, was really fascinating in a way. So I found through a lot of exploration that I needed to do a system that kind of had two parts. So one is inspiring people to do something new, but the other one is actually trying to pinpoint what are some of those patterns that I wanted to pull back from or inhibit. So, so I worked on kind of having this two-part system that would try and pull back certain patterns so that there was more space to explore the new things. So this kind of manifested in, this is not the prettiest system. We're still using the Carnegie Mellon's mocap model right now. But I've worked with a team that has taken this original dance animation software from the 90s called Dance Forms. We now have an iPad version of it called iDance Forms. Yes, and it's sort of keyframe animation based. So you've got all these little stick figures, and you can poke at different joints and manipulate them and create body positions that way, and then you can animate through them to create phrases. You can also use the camera to capture body positions and then map them onto things. So I started really playing with designing a generative component for this, because for all, this technology has now been around for, over 25 years. And it's really for a choreographer to use it, they really need to focus on, pinpointing joints and designing things on this very detailed level, which is not really how dancers work when they're sensing and moving through their environments and listening to other people. So, so this generative component, still based in the keyframe animation component, but I in my little system of inhibiting some things and pushing other ones, used a genetic algorithm in order to generate different positions based on things that would be asymmetrical, unstable, because instability promotes movement because you can't stay still, unusual joint angles just because it makes people think differently, and kept it limb focused instead of core. And in an earlier version of this, I also included a combination of qualitative effort information as well, where as you're trying to make sense of whatever this is, you're also trying to do it in a way that's quick and strong, which is a lot of information for a dancer. But through this, it works in the way that dancers can generate ideas. They can participate in the function, it's got a parameterized fitness function. So they can, that's all based on Laban. So you can shift, how much extension for the limbs there is, and whether you want movement to happen more on one side of the body or across the body. What did I say there? And so, so it gives all these interesting opportunities for how someone can interpret the data, which still is pretty, as you're looking at this as a static form, which is great as an inspiration. Marie Chouinard has a great piece where she took a book of I think it's ink blots that look very similar to this sort of work, and the whole thing is show an ink blot, someone moves that piece. Next ink blot, someone moves the next piece. So this framing of how to create dance out of inspiration has been used forever. But I think here's an example. Do I need to hit the play button?
Just press
one more time? Okay. Okay, so this is an example of someone developing a phrase based on the animation that they created. And this one was pretty traditional of dancers creating, expecting to create a phrase. This next one was a little bit different in that this dancer was very fascinated with the animation process and the experience of touch, and how her current choreographic process was very much about what it felt like to stroke her arm, and how she could feel both from her arm to her hand and from her hand to her arm, and what that meant as she was moving. And so she was trying to animate that, and she was surprised that it took her 15 frames or something. And it's still, as you see this, it's there's a lot of happening in a very slow amount of time, and then it just the rest of it kind of looks thrown away because it's quick. that's basically it. Perfect. Okay, so the last thing I'm just going to wrap up with is then, so we've had a little bit of the recognition of how you're performing and that information is captured in order to control other systems, but then the flip side of how you're generating information that then you can interpret and take and receive that information. So then playing with interaction, there's been a little bit of other work that has played with both of those together. So for example, I'll just say this MViz system. The performer is wearing an accelerometer that is detecting effort qualities. And so that is controlling some of the parameters of a visual system. There's also a Connect that's detecting your body position and changes through space and time. And then there is a LViz, I believe, generated visuals that go along with this that are mapped to various qualities. So it's a very interesting experience to be playing back and forth with, that the expressiveness of your movement is controlling or guiding a particular system, but you're also responding to it in the same way, probably very similar to a very nervous system, and that you're both to be both the controller and the receiver, and it is such a fun improvisational place to be, and gives you a lot of space to play. But I'm going to end it there.
Gotta do it. Terminology? Phonetic algorithm? No? Honestly, if you're good, that's fine, but just in case. All right. Maybe later. Okay, so Chris Salter, on the far left there, is an artist. And he's a Concordia University Research Chair in New Media Technology and the Senses, Concordia in Montreal, and a Professor of Computation Arts in the Department of Design and Computation Arts, and co-director of the Hexagram Network, which is a big research group that crosses several universities in Montreal. Chris.
Thanks, Nell. So I just want to also thank Ryan and everybody at Art Engine for the invitation. It's been great yesterday and also today. So I want to contrast two projects in my talk. One is from a massive Hollywood machinery which just opened in LA. I'm not going to talk too much about this project, and the other is a project that I developed that I'm mainly going to talk about today called Haptic Field, which has been touring in Europe since last year. And what they do is they pose two very different models of bodily experience. So one is based on virtual reality, this alien zoo, and the other is based on what we might call mixed reality, which is the kind of mixing between the digital and the physical. The other difference is that one amplifies the sensorium, your experience of the senses, and gives you everything, and the other removes vision. Haptic field, so the other senses kind of take over. So I'm going to just show you this weird review I just found on YouTube of this project, because there's no documentation of this. This is just opened, and it's obviously very, it was in stealth mode. So this gives you a little bit of sense of this alien zoo pop-up project that's going to be franchised around the world by this new company called Dreamscape Immersive, which is Steven Spielberg is behind it, and big movie companies. Okay, now we're going to see if I push that button. Once more.
What's going on? Rich DeMiro here, Rich on Tech, and I want to tell you about a virtual reality experience I did that is literally unbelievable. I have never done anything like this. So let me explain. I love VR. I think virtual reality is going to be the future of everything. But realistically, all these little headsets and stuff we have, none of them come close to what I experienced through something called Alien Zoo. So this is a new 1-month pop-up immersive experience that's available at the Westfield Century City Mall. That's in West Los Angeles. And Alien Zoo is kind of like the name of the experience. It comes from a company called Dreamscape Immersive. So who is Dreamscape Immersive? Well, this is their first big public-facing project. It is open now. And here's the deal. There are some heavy hitters behind this company. Investors including AMC, because they know cinema is changing. You've got IMAX. You've got former heads of studios like DreamWorks. You've got 3 Hollywood studios on board. Steven Spielberg is an investor in this thing and part of it. So these are some big people with big roots in entertainment, and they are looking for sort of the next big thing in entertainment, and I will be honest, I think they found it. So I don't want to give everything away about what happens, but imagine you step into a virtual world and you are part of it, and you're part of the storyline, you're part of the experience. So let me explain how this happens. So you go to Century City Mall, you get a little ticket for this experience called Alien Zoo, and you walk in, and there's 6 people at a time that get to go to a showing. And the show is 12 minutes, okay? And I can't even call it a show, because it's really an experience. So you go inside, and it's really cool looking inside. I mean, just the design of it is really neat. And I don't know what the premise is, but you're kind of an explorer, or adventurer, whatever you want. And then you go and you get suited up. So they literally put a VR headset on you, a backpack on you, some sort of gloves on your hands and also on your feet. So that way, your entire body, and I didn't realize this until all of a sudden it happens, you turn virtual. So when you go into this pod, you see 6 other people with you. The 6 people that are standing next to you, all of a sudden, when they flip this switch, you all turn virtual.
That's called motion capture, but it's in real time. All right. Now, this is Haptic Field. This was presented in Europe last summer. This is one of the largest museums in Berlin, the Martin Gropius Bau, in an exhibition on immersion. And this describes a little bit of this experience. Well, maybe not. Let's see. Okay, right.
The haptic field tries to create a kind of experience where the senses start to merge and mix together. Visitors arrive and they put on a garment. When one is in this suit, one emits light and one also feels vibration. People put on these goggles, which basically cloud their vision, and then they move through a series of rooms that have varying levels of sensory input. You don't really have a sense of depth. You only see other people moving as shadows that emit light. So there's a kind of weird communication happening between each body in the room. And then you start to move through the other spaces. Occasionally the room completely becomes white. At times it becomes very, very dark. Suddenly the walls seem to emit light. The final space is saturated in a kind of dim color, which is changing very gradually. In many ways, the visitor's experience is the content of the work. There's an incredibly wide range of experiences that people describe, from terror to ecstasy to a kind of meditative state. I see the work as a relation between people and their environments and how those things are merging and interacting with each other.
So here's a little bit of just a short impression of this. Okay, so this is what we call kind of performative environment or sensory environment. So the public moves through a series of luminous and sonic spaces within a kind of continual time frame. So some people stay 20 minutes, some people stay 40, 50 minutes, even sometimes longer. And there are different groups of people, up to 18 people at a time can be in this environment. And so you enter, this is the line, people line up and then they put on this clothing. And then we put on these actuators, which are small devices. They're similar to the technologies in your cell phone. They're all wirelessly controlled. They're called the vibropixels because they both produce light, but they also produce vibration at certain points on the body. And then basically the audience puts on these kinds of safety goggles, which are just frosted. But the frosting does something very strange because what it does is it clouds your vision. It doesn't remove it entirely, but it clouds it. So your understanding of how you find visual cues in space, how you move toward objects is completely transformed and disturbed. So it's as if you're walking through a kind of fog where you can see, but you can't really see. And of course, then you start to feel these kinds of vibrations across your body. And so sometimes the sense is that what you're feeling on your body, you're actually seeing in space because certain of the lights are synchronized with those vibrations, and sometimes they're not. Now, each of the rooms, so in this environment, there were 4 very large-scale rooms, about 190 square meters, moving through these spaces, and each one has a different kind of state to it. One is very, very dark, and so you're not really particularly sure of where you are. And then you enter into a much larger room where you have many, many of these points of light hanging at different heights in the ceiling. But again, these lights are blurred. They're quite, let's say, like haloed in a way. This is this big room, and of course there's other people around you. And so there's accompanying kinds of sound structures as well. In one room there's binaural audio, which is kind of moving back and forth, beating between 2 very close frequencies. So you tend to hear sounds that are actually not there. One room is much more saturated. Sometimes the room suddenly goes black and then bursts with very bright white xenon light, which is very, very cold white light. So your whole field of vision vanishes briefly. And then you go into a room in which the light is no longer in the air, but on the wall. And in fact, every point of light emits sound as well. So as you move toward the light, you hear sound coming out of it. And you're also, again, feeling these vibrations on you. And then the final room is this kind of room, again, video can't demonstrate this because the colors and the shapes are very different in terms of your vision versus what the camera sees. But there's a kind of a field of light above you. It's not around you, but it's somehow in the air, and you don't know where it is. And so there's a sense of kind of a void in space. Now, what becomes interesting is that there are patterns that kind of take place. So it's very, very scored. There's no interaction in the sense that there's some kind of sensor that measures, like what David was showing earlier, the very nervous system earlier project of his, in which your movement is picked up by a camera, and then that camera, the sensor basically maps that to some type of media. There's none of that. But at the same time, there's an incredible amount of interaction. And we think of interaction as human interaction with the environment, as you see kind of in this images of people holding each other and falling and dancing and, kind of getting lost. Now, the interesting thing is, my question is, what happens to oneself in haptic field? And why did I show you this Alien Zoo project earlier? Well, what we've done, not only as artists, but also from a kind of a research perspective, is interview audiences after these experiences. And we've done this in China, we've done this in Europe, we're about to do it in Indonesia in this summer. So very, very different cultural context. In Berlin, we interviewed around 100 people out of the 12,000 that came for 1 month to this exhibition. And we're trying to understand their responses to the work. What's actually happening to them? What's happening to their bodies in space? What's happening to others around them? So what's interesting here is that there's a kind of diffused or dispersed perceiving of the world. And so many of the visitors in our interviews, and there's a group of people who are speaking together. It's my team, but it's also the audience in small groups. So it's not individuals, it's actually groups of 4 or 5 people. So people speak and then start to share collectively their experience, even though they can't necessarily see the others. what becomes very interesting is that people describe the presence, the sense of others around them, but they cannot see them. So they sense somebody, but unlike, for instance, this virtual VR project I showed you earlier, there's no direct one-to-one correspondence between my body and everybody else's, you know? So it's diffused. You sense somebody, but you cannot see them. And so if you can't see somebody, you start to behave in your body very differently than if you can see someone. So what happened, for instance, is people start to do things, and they say this, that they normally would not do in everyday life. They start dancing, they start doing weird kinds of movements, they start moving slowly. They kind of start performing for themselves, but for others, but without the fear of the social mores taking place that you see when, like if I started to take my clothes off here, you would be like, okay, that's very strange. But people would do that in that room because you would only get a sense of like the presence, but not the representation of a body. The other interesting thing is that there's a term that comes from the 1960s from an anthropologist named Edward T. Hall, called proxemics. And proxemics are the sense of how culture creates certain distances between us. We establish certain understanding of space based on our cultural understanding, our cultural training. And what becomes very interesting in haptic field is that goes out the window. So, you know, normally you wouldn't get too close to somebody if you didn't know them. Well, people started to touch. You watch people try to touch others not knowing they're there. You don't know where they are in space because they're actually not in your field of vision. So people would go reach out into nothingness, and the person would be 5 or 6 feet away from them, and then they would try to move toward the other person. Well, the other person would kind of move backwards. So we would watch these kinds of very interesting dynamics that occurred. Now, just to finish up, the comments people have are extremely interesting. One person said they felt like they were connected to everyone. They didn't care who they were. They didn't even care about their gender or their... it was beyond gender, they actually said. They felt connected like fireflies do. You know, so they felt that others were fireflies. Another woman claimed that she felt like she was moving through the stages of her life. She said, well, it's dark, and then I see some light, and I move toward it, but it's actually not there, and I stumble, and I feel like I'm falling, and then I realize this is how I experience the world. It's like I try to grasp for something, and then it's not there, and then I grasp again, and then it appears, but I can't hold on to it. So in many ways, haptic field is a kind of work for the attention overwhelmed. You know, so no one can go on their phone and check Facebook. They can't. They're not connected to the electronic world in any way, even though they're in a completely artificial, technologized space. You know, and there's a term that James Austin, who's a neuroscientist and also a Zen practitioner, has written this very large book many years ago called Zen in the Brain. Talks about when he talks about the notion of absorption, and he says that in absorption, involves a kind of change of focus, but it also signifies a sense of being held or transfixed or riveted, in which other energy infuses the act of attending to something. And I start to find that most of my work is very much about this act of attending. How do you attend to things that are not actually perceptually apparent or clear to you? And because our attention is so fragmented by swiping on the phone and looking at the Instagram feed, or by constantly receiving input, when the input of the environment becomes reduced, your attention starts to transform. And I'll just finish up and play you one comment. So there was an earlier project we did called ilinx, which is a term in Greek which means vertigo. And ilinx was a similar project, although you involve 4 people as opposed to a whole group, and they were also wearing clothing that has wireless, like embedded vibration in it. So it was more complex. Again, people went through a very large environment without kind of knowing where they were. But for the first 7 minutes, they sat in total darkness, and they just felt almost micro-level vibrations across their body. And then in the second part, they were asked to walk through a very large space. And this is a group of very famous musicians from the US called Underground Resistance who went through the environment. And I'll just play you a comment from one of them.
space felt like after you got an operation and you didn't make it, you died. And you're wondering what's coming next. And you're dead, you know you're dead, but the electronic part of you is still going. And you can't, everything that you knew is gone, and you don't know what to expect. And it's just, it was the strangest feeling. The further into it you went, the further away from what you knew.
So I find that very interesting. The further into it, the further you didn't know. And so in very interesting ways, I think these projects deal with the fact that the more presence or the more embodied we feel, the less we have a sense of the self that we so hold on to so dearly. Thank you.
Well, throwing out all my notes I had, of course. So, well, that was interesting because I thought overall that we're not seeing in the works that you guys all showed anything you'd call strong AI or those kinds of like agents that pass the Turing test. So we believe that they're intelligent computers. But I wondered if you could each comment on how, nonetheless, there are aspects to what you're doing that they invoke a kind of getting ready or readiness. Like you talked about Maurice Chouinard's ink blots or your genetic algorithms. They're a kind of, they're chance. They come from what we would call like a somewhere else, or there's this very strong sense of a someplace else. It doesn't have to be personified in any way. Same here, that the system does something unexpected. So how do you feel, it's kind of two-part question, because the other part is, we could leave it, but I'll just launch it. Do you think that we're actually going to perceive a threshold, between feeling in control, running our technologies, and really strong AIs, machine learning systems where they are autonomous? Is there an R autonomous out there, and we're going to know when we cross that threshold? But anyway, first question first, like how is there a sort of readiness? Yeah, that's a pretty big philosophical one, think about it. But how is there a sort of readiness sense in what you're doing? Who wants to go first?
Readiness for?
Readiness for the sense of pardon? Aliens, yeah. No, readiness for a kind of otherness, like that they're autonomous, that there's some agency there that is beyond what you've programmed in and what you're able to run, to control. Yeah.
So I made a conscious decision during the 10 years I worked on Very Nervous System to not take a step towards having the system adapt to the user or learn from the user, for a very specific reason, and that was that I realized I did not understand enough about my own response in the space or other people's response to the system. I needed to start, before I started to add the complexity of an intelligence or an adaptive system, I needed to know better what was actually happening in the person. And so it was way too preliminary to start adding other stuff that would just muddy that question, because I thought until I understood that question, I couldn't even understand then what how the experience had changed with the addition of that adaptation. So that's my first response.
But the question presented itself.
Absolutely presented itself.
It's built into.
Absolutely, yes.
Other comments?
I have, well, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to say that a system I did not build but worked closely with was using computer vision in order to detect trajectories of movement throughout an environment, but then it was generating flute music for dancers improvising. And there was a lot of breath built into that system, so there was this embodied kind of anticipatory cues, so that the performers had a sense of the computer, not just seeing something, making a direct correlation. Yes, that there was a much more complex relationship that was kind of body oriented, which I'll just say playing with that was really, so the system had a different readiness that was adapting and changing over time, which often with those kinds of systems, when you don't have those embodied cues, it's always a little bit of a shock of what's going to happen next, and you're trying to predict something that you don't know at all. So this system was very different in that your personal embodied readiness was engaged, and that you could understand, you knew what the length of the phrase was going to be. And that was a very different organic experience of playing and feeling like you were a little bit more in control of how you could respond and engage with the system. That was fascinating.
So haptic field is an absolutely fixed composition, right? It's timed. It has to be precise because of the certain temporal relations that David was talking about earlier in terms of our own perception. And maybe Sophie and we'll talk about, we've done another project that involves actually real-time machine learning. If, for instance, the environment was controlled by some kind of algorithm, machine learning algorithm that takes in data and then try to produce behaviors based on it with the light or sound, you wouldn't know the difference as an audience. It just doesn't matter in some ways for the way we would use that. So at the same time, you're very aware that in haptic field, you're inside an environment which is not human in the sense that it's orchestrated by machines, okay? And so you feel part of that technical milieu. You feel that you are part of it. You are not outside of it. The technology is not over there and you're over here. So it's much more of a kind of diffusion, like a kind of particulate in the sense of like haze in a room where your bodies are really kind of linked with this environment, and the environment is human and it's also technical, and so in some ways it prepares one for, as we get more and more having the sense of diffuse technology out in the world that we inhabit, that we have to start to understand that those technical others are actually us in some ways, so.
I mean, I often think of artists setting up these rehearsals. It's one of our roles. I think especially in this domain, in the technological domain, that you set up ways for people to address something, sense something that then maybe they can put language to. I mean, that becomes,
try.
Yeah.
It's in the moment of experience, it's very difficult to put language to something. Because especially the kinds of projects we're looking at, where you're trying to grapple with what's happening, what's happening in the world to me. So.
David?
I think it's important to note the role of vulnerability in these projects, and that's one of the other things that gives me pause in relationship to applying a lot of machine learning to it, because the obvious thing when you take an intense feedback loop, if you add a very disciplined mechanism that's very good at detecting, modeling nuance into that feedback loop, the potentials for rigorous control are astonishing. I mean, pleasure feedback loops, a system that adapts to what you clearly want to have happen. It's feedback to you to maximize the time you spend there, or it's not very hard to imagine using a system to guide movement quite specifically, and politically I find that very problematic.
Yeah, that's true, but I think that we're talking about, this is very old, and you've brought it up, especially Chris, it's an old favorite topic of mine. I mean, in a way we want that, we're drawn to that. It's really pleasurable to lose yourself, right?
Well, yes, but the difference is, I mean, I think it's certainly an intention in very nervous system, and certainly an intention in haptic fields, and perhaps in, something that's implicit in some of your work, that losing oneself is a goal, but it implies a vulnerability, and when the system is static and you can get to know it and you come to a point of trust, however that's established, however the artist has established a willingness to expose yourself, there's a danger, then okay, so now I will take the fact that you've granted me that vulnerability and I will take it somewhere else. Because of course it's fascinating, the idea of then adding a very articulate learning system into the system, into that scenario. And it would be very pleasurable, but there's a challenge with infinite pleasure, right? I mean, even talking about the generative role of frustration. Well, we can remove frustration, right? We can engineer it away. Is that what should happen?
I remember a piece by the group Granular Synthesis that I saw a good 10 years ago at least, where you went into this closed space, and the medical teams were stationed outside the door, because the intention was an experience so intense, I had to be locked to a guide. I wouldn't do it. But yeah, so people have played with that. I don't know. I think Kristin was up next.
Well, and David, I wanted to ask, when you talked a little bit about playing with very nervous system, but then having this opening of awareness and feeling so connected to your environment, and that carrying through once you went out into the world, do you feel like you would have been able to achieve that experience in a way if you hadn't been vulnerable with the technology?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there are two parts of that question. Would I have been able to have that experience if I hadn't become vulnerable to technology? I think any opening of your awareness involves vulnerability, because you're moving away from familiar space. So unless there was some willing to do that, I would go back to my habitual experience of the exterior space. The other question is, why does it take technology to do that? And the answer is it doesn't. But I found it interesting to be in a city on a busy, living off a busy city street in a downtown core, and generating a kind of awareness that may be more likely to happen after 24 hours of hiking in the woods or something. Just saying, okay, so how can I use the very technology that creates the tumult around me and turn it upside down? Because I'm a bit of a contrarian. I'm always looking to turn these things upside down. Can I use the technology to take me back through a series of sort of, I don't know what, to some other state that it would not normally be used to generate?
It's interesting. So there's this French philosopher, Michel Foucault, talks about this term technology. And he has a very unusual definition of technology. He calls technology as a means of governance. It's a strategy for governance. Meaning, so there's an external understanding of that, like, the state governs our actions, but then he also says that technology is a means of self-governance, meaning that we govern ourselves. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we internalize these exterior structures and we start acting and governing our behavior in certain ways. And he becomes interested in what he calls technologies of self, of the self. And the technology of the self are, how do we shape ourselves so we become either, we achieve ecstasy or immortality or some form of extreme emotion, to do that. And we're doing that now all the time. We're actually shaping our behavior based on what the exterior systems tell us, but we don't even have to look at them. We just kind of, I'm supposed to move this way because my Fitbit has told me to act this way. And so I start reshaping my behavior based on just a kind of prompt, as opposed to waiting for exterior kind of control, So this is very interesting, this kind of a control, that there's an exterior system, but at the same time then one starts to adapt one's behavior to how one thinks one should behave according to that exterior system.
I think, having said what I've said, there's an inverse, and I think it's sort of conjured up a bit by some of the things that you said, Kristin, about using systems to change one's assumptions about what movement might be and to kind of push beyond the limits of what we would naturally do as a human being. So it's not a question of being too tied to a traditional notion of what the body might do. One can imagine a machine learning system that is a profound corrective for a real problem, emotional or physical, that we have. It is, however, and that's fantastic, but it is tricky territory given the political media environment that we live in.
I'm going to do one more question before we throw it out, and that is sort of elicited by your presentation, Chris, and that is, do you all feel a pressure, I guess, from the entertainment world with regards to how you work, or does it have no impact on you? I'm not suggesting that you feel driven by the fact that, what are they called again? Dreamscape, etc. Aliens do Dreamscape? Yeah.
So that's a super interesting question, because now I've been approached by some companies in Quebec because of haptic field, we want to do that. We want to mix VR and MR and this real physical thing, and so in fact the line gets less and less clear between, especially when one deals with experience. So this term experience, John Dewey, the American philosopher and educator, wrote a book in the 1930s called Art as Experience. In which he said, actually the artworks are not about this exterior thing over there. It's about how we as human beings enter into the work and produce meaning out of it through the non-separability of us and the work, And this is, there was an article in the New York Times a few years ago about when the Wii controllers came out with, wireless accelerometers, and where this author said, wow, I really feel that games are no longer about something out there, but my experience. And so the term experience has become, there's a whole book, called The Experience Economy from these two Harvard business, experience design. Experience has become the kind of new mode in capitalism and the senses as well, and so it's just like the machine learning thing. It's a very, very tricky territory, because and the reason I showed this alien zoo and then haptic field is they're actually very different understandings of experience. One gives you everything, and then you feel, oh my God, I touched the wet nose of the giraffe or whatever, and haptic field doesn't give you that much. So you're falling back on your own experience, and you go through all these stages between some people will say, oh, I'm bored, and then I'm ecstatic, and some people fall asleep, and it's this completely strange thing, because that's not how you're supposed to behave in an artwork, right? It's supposed to be like focus, and you look at the thing, and then you look at the next thing, and and it's good for you. It's a classic kind of art is supposed to be good cultural stuff. Experience, that's entertainment. That's like frivolous. So I think the line gets more and more blurred in that sense.
Well, also using kind of off the shelf, whether it's, we probably all use Kinects. They're just so handy.
We design all that stuff.
Okay. Or AI off the shelf, it could be anything, right, that we grab. So that's also, I guess, a facet of it. And then the other part of it is a kind of pressure, I suppose, from being researchers. It's kind of the opposite end from entertainment, but still there's a sort of pressure, I find, even through that research agenda to know about entertainment and to situate yourself, vis-a-vis what's like really happening in the world, as opposed to our kind of end of it. Yeah,
I have had companies come to me at various times over my career, and I tend to have a very visceral, problematic anti-entrepreneurial instinct, and I tend to go all flaky at the moments when I get these questions. Also, that was my response to the Defense Department too when they came to me in the the mid 80s. Big mistake or the best thing I ever did, I'm not sure, but I think a really important distinction is, as Chris said, the not supplying everything. And right foundationally from the beginning, before I did Very Nervous System, my interest in interactivity was not about creating devices that gave you everything. It was about creating ways of creating emptinesses. So as an artist, I create resonant emptiness. I create spaces where things can happen. And so I'm trying to reduce but make places that will, like the inside of a guitar's sound is made by the empty space inside it. So that is my job. And that never seems to be the job of Disney. Right.
Well, it again has to do with the level of control, because Disney, in order for a Disney experience to work, every single aspect of how you respond to it has to be absolutely controlled, from the moment the music to how you move, and that's why it's called Imagineering, right? And here there's gaps in these works, so they don't give you everything, you know. And so you're having to make up the story. And so it's so interesting when you talk about narratives. Like these people in Quebec were saying to me, "How is it possible to keep people an hour in this space without a story?" And I said, "Well, people are making up stories that are much more interesting than the stories you can make up." You know, I mean. But the thing about research is really interesting because, again, it's a very slippery slope. So the CTO, the two CTOs of this Dreamscape interactive or immersive company are two computer scientists from Switzerland who run a nonprofit organization called Art NM who designed this technology. And so that it's just like Geoffrey Hinton and all of these researchers who develop machine learning and deep learning and artificial neural networks are all working for Google and Facebook now, you know. So that line is also very, very, gets more and more blurred, you know, and capitalism wants it blurred. You know, so research is really good because it will build the next tools that will make, you know, will go public and make someone $1 billion.
Something to say?
I mean, I'm agreeing with all of this, and I feel like, you know, artists, you know, traditionally are very good at leaving those spaces to explore, and, you know, Brecht did a lot of this work as well with defamiliarization and creating performances that enabled people to make, you know, to try and engage and understand what was happening. And, you know, theater spaces would be super industrial and bare, and you're imagining what the surroundings could be, and it's that pulling back away from what you're used to seeing that engages you to use your imagination. And I keep thinking a little bit about interactive film, and that work has been happening forever. But, you know, the first piece has come to Netflix within the last few months of where you can, you know, click your way through a choose your own story. But again, it's completely controlled. There's no randomness. There's no generation. There's nothing. No space. That couldn't be controlled.
It erases the history of it too, because it's like, this is all new.
Yeah.
You know, so you're in a new world. You know, ignoring the fact that it's actually not a new world.
Yeah, and any time that there's some interactive work, or not even interactive, we'll just say media work included in like galas and Academy Award ceremonies and things where there's projections on someone's dress. There's no way for them to robustly control anything interactive. Like, everything is done in a very pristine, precise way that cannot be messed up. And I feel like even contemporary theater now is still, you know, you still need that stage manager to be able to control all the pieces in order for everything to move smoothly. And it's hard to find places that are going to be accepting of accidents.
And that word control is really key to me. The technologies we use are all about control. They're designed for control. They're exquisitely good at controlling. And some of us are perversely drawn to find ways to use those to do the opposite, to create spaces which are not about control. And on a philosophical level, it's almost like, for me, it's an attempt to understand, is there any hope for our culture? Like, can we take these things which are invading our culture, can we also use them for something other than their most obvious intentional use? And I think if we can't find alternatives, we're toast. You know, we have to keep pushing the other than obvious narrative or agenda that the machines, by their very nature, will put forward. And when we think about then machine learning, which is incredibly good at absorbing a data set and giving us some sense of it, it's not clear yet exactly how to use that to let go. Like, it's very good. It's beautiful, incredible about how good it is at finding nuance and stuff like that. But so many artists I know who are deep in the machine learning, they're still going, I have no idea how to use this for art. No idea. Yeah.